Great, welcome everyone. Kim, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, before we get started, just going to give a couple of instructions. Tammy, next slide. And one more. The session is being recorded. You should have seen a pop-up to that effect. Your microphones were muted when you came in, but there's going to be plenty of opportunity for you to engage. You can raise your hand or use the chat feature. We also have closed captioning enabled today. In order to use closed captioning, you'll see a live transcript button, the bottom of your screen to the right of the green share screen button. If you click that, you'll be able to see live subtitles as we're going through. We'll also be using polling and breakout rooms today. Next slide. To use the chat, to the left of the share screen button, there is a chat function. You can just open that up by clicking that button and send chats to everybody in the room. Please feel free to experiment with that right now. Let us know your name and if you represent an organization today. Love to get to know you. And next slide. To raise your hand before being called on to speak, you can use the raise hand button. You find that in the reactions tab. This is to the right of the share screen button. You click reactions and there's a couple options there, but one of those is raise hand. If you put your hand up, everyone will be able to see it and one of the facilitators will call on you to speak. And next slide. Our agenda today, we just finished the instructions. Susan Milhauser with DLCD is going to do a welcome. Sadie Carney will do a land acknowledgement. We have participant polling, project overview, and then we'll be going into breakout rooms for a discussion and then a brief report back. At the end of today, we'll talk about next steps. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Susan for welcome and introductions.
Great. Thank you, Kim. Good afternoon. My name is Susan Milhauser, and I'm a natural hazards wildfire planner with the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the staff lead for the Wildfire Adapted Communities Project. We're glad to see so many people who are interested in this important topic and look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas today. DLCD truly appreciates the time you're taking to participate, and we hope that you'll feel like it was time well spent. I'd like to introduce Sadie Carney with DLCD, who will be reading a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together.
All right. Thank you, Sadie. Next, Commissioner Stuart Warren, a member of the Land Conservation and Development Commission, will offer some opening remarks. Commissioner Warren represents Southern Oregon and joined the commission in October 2020. Take it away, Commissioner Warren.
Thank you, Susan, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Susan said, I am a Land Conservation Development Commission member representing Southern Oregon. I was also a city council member in 2020 when the Alameda fire burnt through my hometown of Phoenix, Oregon, where we lost nearly 1,200 homes and about 100 commercial buildings. So sadly, I have firsthand experience with how wildfire impacts community, and especially our communities of color and low-income individuals. Thank you again for being here today. At the Land Conservation Development Commission, we really value community engagement, and we're really looking forward to hearing your stories. And by sharing your stories with us, we can help to make informed decisions about wildfire planning in Oregon with the goal of reducing future wildfire disruptions. Your input can make a real difference for Oregon, and I encourage you to speak up or send us an email or drop something in the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking in front of others. Once again, thank you so much for being here, and now back to Susan.
Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Susan. So we're going to do a little bit of polling to get to know folks in the room. First question is, what part of Oregon do you live in? folks a couple more seconds. Given that today's session is dedicated to the Willamette Valley, Oregon coast, or specializing there, unsurprisingly, we have a lot of folks from the Willamette Valley and the Oregon coast, but we've got a little spattering of everything. Folks from Central Oregon, Eastern, Southern, and quite a few from the Portland metro area. So welcome everybody today. Second, how would you describe where you live? And please check all that apply. We've got a really good split. A third of our folks in city, another third in small town, and then a bunch more in rural. So looks like we've got quite the mix here today. It's exciting. And our last question. Wildfire has impacted every Oregonian in some way. If you feel comfortable, please share with us how wildfire has impacted you. This is a long list, so scroll down and please check all that apply. I know there's quite a few options, so giving folks a little more time to answer. So a lot of folks talk about outdoor, indoor air quality and the mental and physical health impacts that go along with wildfire. Several have been evacuated or living situation changes or even lost their home or business. Folks know someone who lost their home, and our deepest sympathies go to those who know someone who lost their life, and gratitude to those working in response and recovery work. Thank you for sharing today. And Susan, would you like to lead us in our project overview?
Yeah, great, thank Kim. So, all right, I'm going to spend a few minutes sharing a project overview. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we can address them shortly. Next slide, please. Here's some information about the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Our mission is to help communities and people plan for, protect, and improve the built and natural systems that provide a high quality of life. In partnership with community members like you all and local governments, we foster sustainable and vibrant communities and protect our natural resources legacy. Next slide. DLCD's Wildfire Adapted Communities Project is in response to Senate Bill 762, passed by the Oregon legislature in 2021. Senate Bill 762 is a comprehensive wildfire preparedness and resiliency bill that takes a proactive approach to help modernize and improve wildfire preparedness through three key strategies: creating fire-adapted communities, developing safe and effective response, and increasing the resiliency of Oregon's landscapes. DLCD's focus is on the first item. Next slide, please. The legislation requires action from multiple state agencies with the aim of providing long-term security for our state by minimizing loss of life and property, protecting the lives of firefighters, protecting and managing Oregon's forest assets, and creating a more predictable and protected future for communities and development at risk to the impacts of wildfire. The Wildfire Programs Director, Doug Graff, in the Governor's Office and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council are responsible for coordination and oversight. DLCD's work is closely aligned with the work of the Oregon Department of Forestry, responsible for the wildfire risk map in conjunction with Oregon State University, the Oregon State Fire Marshal, responsible for defensible space code updates, and the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs, responsible for updates to building codes for home hardening. Other agencies are focused on community risk reduction, public health, air quality, and utilities. Next slide, please. Regarding the statewide map of wildfire risk, Senate Bill 762 provided legislative direction to the Board of Forestry regarding the wildland-urban interface and statewide fire risk mapping, among other requirements. Oregon Department of Forestry initiated a rulemaking process in 2021 to guide this work. The final map will be available June 30 of this year and will include wildland-urban interface boundaries and fire risk classes, and will be updated to reflect current wildfire risk every 5 years. Next slide, please. So under Section 11 of Senate Bill 762, DLCD is tasked with identifying recommendations for updates to the statewide land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes needed to incorporate the wildfire risk map and minimize wildfire risk. Excuse me. The recommendations must include appropriate levels of state and local resources necessary for effective implementation and may allow for regional differences. Next slide, please. The recommendations may include, but are not limited to, provisions regarding sufficient defensible space, building codes, safe evacuation, and development considerations in areas of extreme or high wildfire risk. Next slide. DLCD's report is due by October 1st to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and the legislature. The council then may advance refined or additional recommendations to the legislature. During the 2023 legislative session, the legislature may act to direct DLC to undertake additional work. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today's listening session is to get input from you all on how to address wildfire risk in state and land use planning programs. Your ideas and feedback will inform DLCD's recommendations to the council and legislature. And the listening sessions are part of a larger engagement process through which we're aiming for broad participation, excuse me, and to engage underserved Oregonians. We have multiple opportunities for involvement, including an online open house and survey and the formation of a stakeholder advisory group. We are also in consultation with tribal governments, and we'll share a little more about the engagement in our next steps at the end. Next slide, please. Here's a brief overview of wildfire trends in Oregon from Wildfire Programs Director Graph. As you can see, there's been a doubling of area burned over each of the past 3 decades. Next slide, please. Also, the locations of where wildfires have burned has expanded across much of the state, as shown on this and the following 2 maps. And lastly, this satellite imagery from NASA captures the devastating 2020 wildfires in Oregon. Smoke from the wildfires and the associated health and economic impacts are just one way that all Oregonians have been impacted by wildfires. In addition to the devastating loss of life, homes, and businesses, other significant economic and environmental implications include loss of infrastructure, cultural resources, and tourism, transportation and power interruptions, and negative impacts to watersheds, wildlife habitat, timber, agriculture, and recreation. I'll now turn it over to Libby for an introduction to the breakout rooms.
Thank you, Susan. Next slide, Tammy. I wanted to set the stage for the discussion that we will have when we go into the breakout rooms. The 2 questions that DLCD is working to answer is, how do we protect what we have? And how do we plan for growth? Next slide, Tammy. There are some potential solution buckets, including statewide land use planning program updates, local comp plan and zoning code updates, funding, research, and partnership. We also know that there are more solutions than what are in these 3 buckets, and we are hoping to hear from you ideas in these solution buckets, but also broader and any ideas that you have based on your part of Oregon. Next slide. Also, recommendations can include, but are not limited to, provisions about sufficient defensible space, building codes, safe evacuations, and development considerations. When we get into our breakout rooms, there'll be more instructions, but the 2 questions for you is, what issues do you feel are most important when considering wildfire risk? And also, what solutions would you like to see implemented to protect from wildfire risk? And with that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
So we have 4 breakout rooms set up today. The first one, you'll see the title is Willamette, or Oregon Coast and Willamette. I'd also encourage our folks who are joining us from Eastern, Southern, and Central Oregon to join that room. It's the first one that you'll see on the screen when it pops up. Then we have 3 breakout rooms below that that are all dedicated to the Willamette Valley. Part of the reason for doing this is to make sure that we can hear everybody during this listening session. Everybody has a chance to participate. My request is that when you are looking and selecting a room, try to look at how many people are in each room, select the one that has the fewest so we can even out those numbers. In a second, I'm going to open up all of the breakout rooms. You should see a pop-up that comes up that has a list of the breakout rooms. If you don't, on the bottom right hand of your screen to the right of the share screen, green share screen button, there will be a breakout rooms button. And if you click on that, then you'll get the pop-up. What you'll see is the 4 breakout rooms listed below and a join button to the right of each of them. Select the join button of the room you would like to join, and you should get zooped right there by the Zoom Genie. So I'm going to open up the rooms now. Trish is going to stay in this main room and assist anybody who has technical difficulties.
Thanks, Kim.
Yeah.
All right, well, why don't we get started? And then if we have more folks join us, we can welcome them in as well. But just wanted to welcome everyone to our breakout room. We'll be here for about 35 minutes or so, talking about the 2 questions that Libby identified. And those are, what issues you feel are most important in considering wildfire risk, and what solutions would you like to see implemented? My name is Chris Hoffman, and I'll be your facilitator for our time together. And then also with us today is Aubrey Koenig, who is helping take notes for everything we discuss, and then Matt Kroll from the DLCD. Matt, I don't know if you want to say hi or introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Matt Kroll with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation Development.
All right. Because we do have a pretty good sized group, I would ask that if you would like to speak to raise your hand. And again, if you look at the bottom of the screen and look at reactions, you can click on that, and then there'll be a button to click on there to raise your hand. At the end of our session, we'll do a little wrap up to kind of highlight the key issues that came up during our discussion, and then I'll report out when we get back to the entire group. And so with that, I think we'll get started. I'd like to kick off with our first question, and that is, again, what issues do you feel are most important to consider, most important when considering wildfire risk? Any takers out there? I know there's got to be someone who's willing to be our first contributor today. No, and if I'll do my best to plant a little seed here, but in some of our past meetings, we've talked about issues around transportation and evacuation. So I don't know if those are issues in where you work or live, or if there's others regarding building codes or defensible space, some other ideas.
Did you see Jason's hand?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see the hand go up. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
My perspective is narrowly focused on my own profession and my role at the city of Corvallis, but from a land use planning perspective and thinking about the purposes of an urban growth boundary, we work in a confined space and have to try to balance many sometimes competing objectives and goals within urban growth boundaries. And I honestly don't know what the risk is in my community compared to, say, Bend or other cities in Oregon. And so I think really I'm here just to kind of learn what are the existing goals and policies and regulations around this? How will it impact our community, and what should we expect moving forward. I'm always thinking at the high level, and how do we balance needing to provide land for jobs and housing, and meet our other goal 5 and goal 7 requirements. And then picking up this additional concern about wildfire hazard.
Great, thank you. And as a reminder, when you speak for the first time, if you could let us know where you're from and what your kind of affiliation is here to this meeting, that's helpful as well. So it's good to hear that context.
So I'm Jason Yike, planning manager at the city of Corvallis.
Great. And looks like Representative McLean, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to let you know that I was here to listen, and I'm going to have staff take over when I have to go to another meeting. But we're just real curious to find out what local jurisdictions are really feeling about the work that was done on the zoning that we put around houses and put around our urban areas, and just finding out what the challenges are. I also agree with you that transportation, which I co-chair the transportation committee, joint transportation committee, that there are a lot of things. If we're going to talk about urban growth boundaries and land use, we need to talk about transportation at the same time. And so I want to make sure that because we need functionality in a wide variety of places, whether it be resiliency or whether it be wildfires or whether it be just getting our folks around the community to their jobs, their homes, and other trips.
Yes, thank you for that comment. That's been a common theme that we've heard throughout all these sessions, is it's difficult to look at wildfire in a vacuum because there's so many other things that need to be coordinated on many different levels, and that it's not just a single issue that a lot of communities are dealing with when it comes to wildfire. It's like Susan Knudsen, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, I live in Oak Ridge, and we were one of the few corridors that didn't burn up last year during the fire season. And I live along Highway 58, which the only way in and out is west or east. Otherwise, we're surrounded by mountains. So we're at a risk. The last year's fire that we had was only 2 miles from my home. My home did not get in one of the evacuation levels, but one of our pieces of property did, and we did get up to level 2. So, I worry about getting people in and out. We ended up having lots of time because they were able to contain the fire, but getting people out of our area, I think, is going to be very, very difficult. There were a few people that did evacuate just in case because they had animals or whatever, but I really think getting people out of communities is hard. I'm also on the board of Lane Electric, and part of our service territory was up in McKinsey, and one of our board members lived up there. And getting out of McKinsey when they did evacuate was very, very difficult. Long lines, the highway got blocked by falling trees, and they were kind of in the same boat. You could either go west or east, and it was very dangerous for people to leave. So somehow we have to figure out a way of getting people out of some of these areas because we do live in the forest.
That's great feedback. Were there since you experienced that directly, were there other challenges that you faced related to the wildfire risk?
Well, we already have an air quality issue in Oak Ridge just due to the topography. And so smoke was bad. We had smoke for weeks and weeks. We actually, my husband and I have an Airbnb cabin that's just over the hill from where we live, not very far. And we were surprised at how many people from the valley came up here to get away from the smoke in the valley, and then we got hit with the smoke, and so it was difficult. Plus we had COVID to deal with. It just seemed like there was one thing piled on another thing. And, we felt really fortunate because they were able to keep the fire down. But, I worked for the Forest Service for 35 years and I was on a fire team. And so I knew what to listen for and I knew what to watch for. Not everybody did. So that was a lot of concern. And I knew that we were going to be okay as long as we didn't have east winds. If an east wind would have came up, our community would have been gone. It's, for me, that was very easy to figure out. So I think those were the big issues, the transportation and the smoke. And, we don't have mills here anymore. So we rely on a lot of tourist dollars. And so a lot of businesses suffered because, people weren't traveling because of all the smoke. It was very, very smoky here.
Yeah, so a couple things interesting to me that you said where you actually had people coming into a wildfire area because they thought they were escaping smoke.
Yes.
So that's an interesting challenge that your community faced. And then it sounds like, you were knowledgeable about the wildfires because of your experience and kind of felt like you knew when it was safe and maybe not so safe, but other people in the community might not have. So was communication to folks a challenge, or getting the information out in an accurate and timely way?
I think we ended up having some really, really good fire teams here for our fire. And they did an excellent job having community meetings and keeping things posted for people. I think if that hadn't have happened, if we would have had a fire team that wasn't as up on communication as they were, I think it would have been a huge issue. But because they opened it up to the public and had a lot of community meetings, I think that helped a great deal. But there was a lot of fear because people, they were looking at what was happening up the Sandy Am and what was happening up the McKenzie and what was happening in Southern Oregon. And we knew we were an east-west corridor, and that's what they all were. And they were losing homes left and right. And so it was very scary for people. But I think you have to find really good ways to communicate what's going on with the community so that they know what's going on.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Did anyone else with Susan's input have anything else they'd like to add in terms of issues that you see in your communities or where you work and live? Give folks some time to think, but the other side of the equation is that we'd like to talk some about potential solutions to protect communities from wildfire risk. And I think one thing that I heard Susan say was, the good communication that her community was fortunate to have in terms of the community meetings and postings and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if folks have suggestions for solutions for some of the other issues that we've talked about, whether it's transportation or balancing competing objectives and goals, air quality, health, businesses and tourism suffering, and those sorts of things. Again, this is just, this is a brainstorming session. There's no right or wrong answer. We're just looking for ideas at this point. And Jason, I'm going to come back to you.
I can speak a little bit to at least a very minor, simple goal 5 and goal 7 analysis during periodic review. And when we
Sorry, Jason, can I interrupt you just for a sec? So
Sure.
for those of us who don't know what goals 5 and 7 are, could you identify those?
Sure, sorry. So under the statewide planning program, communities need to respond to planning goals around natural hazards, which is goal 7. Goal 5 is natural resources. That includes natural resources, but also historic resources, cultural resources. Under the statewide goal 7, wildfire is considered a hazard for planning purposes. And so when we had to go through periodic review back in the late 90s, into the early 2000s, we adopted inventories in our community for hazards and resources. We did not adopt any kind of wildland urban interface information or wildfire risk as part of that. And so that's always been a missing question in our community. And I don't know whether Corvallis really has any real risk compared to other communities. But at the time, we were also trying to protect wildlife habitat and riparian corridors because we were required to under Goal 5 and do an EC analysis to try to balance providing land for housing and land for jobs, but also protecting resources and protecting development against the hazards. So we do have provisions in our code today that allow creating defensible space on private property, particularly where normally the property is required to protect vegetation because of the other resource protection requirements. They get an exemption to remove vegetation that is basically fuel for the wildfires. So that's in our code today. I think we'd probably look to strengthen that moving forward and as we get more information.
And do you find there's much confusion within the community about, I guess, the one side of kind of protecting the vegetation, but then also wanting to remove it in the right places to help, create that defensible space?
Yeah, there's definitely different perspectives in the community on that. And I think once it's explained to them, they can kind of see the balancing that needs to go on. Right now, that allowance to create defensible space is not a requirement. It's an option for property owners. And so that's moving forward is going to be a question our community is going to have is, are we going to enact requirements to actually remove vegetation and create defensible space?
Well, that's interesting. Are there folks on here who have similar situations where it's currently an option to create defensible space, or are there requirements within your communities? Looks like Susan, you have your hand up again, so I'll call on you.
I'm not really sure if we have any of that, but I'm part of the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative, and we've gotten some grants where we're working with some of the landowners on the edges of our community that to help them make their property more fire resilient and clean up some of the brush and all of that. So that's kind of what we're doing, because we live in the middle of forest land. I mean, our town is totally surrounded by Willamette National Forest. So and I know I worked in timber in the Forest Service, so I was part of, we did timber sales to provide, to try to thin some of the area around Oak Ridge and Westford just for fire. And so we've done some of that, but we still have a lot of property owners that need some help with their property. And so that's what these grants are helping us do. And we've hired a local contractor they're working on it right now to help landowners. They've met with a lot of landowners to help them provide some of that defensible space, clean up the brush, clean up some of the invasive weeds and stuff that will carry fire. So those are some of the things that we're doing now.
So in your area, it sounds like it's really looking at providing incentives to do that work to create that defensible space rather than code requirements or any other mechanism.
I think once you have a fire, you get scared, and I think fear in itself sort of took care of a lot of that. When people had to pack their cars and be ready to move, I think that was a big, just something that caused people to think about what they needed to do. And maybe they didn't have the money, or maybe they weren't physically capable. And so to get these grants and to be able to have contractors come in and help with that, that's been huge. So I really think fear was the big factor.
Sorry to interrupt y'all. There's only about 15 minutes left. Susan, good to see you.
Hi, Tricia.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks, Susan. I'm curious if there's anyone else who is dealing with similar issues around whether to, require any type of clearing to create that defensible space, or looking at from the other angle with, providing incentives, or if you have any other solutions that you're currently contemplating or implementing in your communities. Someone besides Jason or Susan has to have something to say.
Hi, this is Lindsay Eichner from Lane County Planning, and I'm sorry I was a little bit late. I had a conflict earlier. We have actually done a couple of work sessions with our Board of Commissioners on getting direction on expanding our forest zone fire siting standards to the whole county, and trying to come up with some options for understanding that certain areas may be less at a fire risk than others. And so we're still scoping what that's going to look like, but we are looking at trying to have countywide fire siting standards, possibly to a lesser degree than our normal forest zones. But and then we also have a Firewise grant program. It only gives about $2,000 to property owners to do clearance, but it also gives them some additional money to replace single pane windows, replace wood shake roofs, use fire resistant siding, doing some screening around the homes and things to incentivize. It doesn't cover the full cost typically, but it does help, and it gets staff out on site to do assessments and education to the property owners who really want to do protection around their homes. We actually had one property owner come back within the last couple of weeks, and he had done over $20,000 of improvements to his home and property, which was, we were blown away. I think that's the most we've had come in at one time. But that's optional. It's actually, we tried to prioritize people outside of fire districts with wood shake roofs in more high risk areas this last year. But there's always a big interest in that program.
Yeah, that was my next question was how are you implementing that if you're prioritizing certain areas or different types of land uses, but it sounds like you are doing that.
Yeah, we haven't necessarily done that in the past, but this last grant cycle we did, and I think it was really made a larger impact to the community, I think, focusing on those very high risk properties.
All right, well, thank you, Lindsay. Anyone else with things that you're trying or considering trying in your communities? Matt, do you have any insights or questions for the group that you'd like to throw out there?
Well, I don't know if I have any insights, but questions, I guess. I think we've talked some here about some of the evacuation, about some of the building, fire resistant building that can help protect the buildings. But one of the big questions is, as new development happens, are there different requirements, different standards might apply? I heard a little bit about that, how that might be in Lane County, but be interested in feedback or suggestions other places as to the kind of criteria, factors, or considerations that would be applied to new development.
We've got a quiet group today. All right. Well, anyone else have anything they'd like to ask, or things that any of the conversations spurred other issues that you're facing within your communities, or ideas for how to address those issues and protect from wildfire risk? Ken, looks like you have your hand up.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Vogany, Emergency Manager, City of Springfield. So just a couple things. I'm really here to try to learn a little bit more about this topic overall. Eugene and Springfield are looking at doing a multi-jurisdictional community wildfire protection plan. So as part of that, okay, what's all the things we need to do or consider? But also just tossing a couple of other thoughts in concerning the holiday farm fire and wondering where these may fit in overall into the SB 762. And that had to do with utilities. Through the holiday farm fire, we experienced hundreds of utility poles that came down, underground utilities that were compromised or destroyed, like fiber optic communication cables, et cetera. We lost communication towers. So within that broader scope, maybe I'll toss it this way, is the PUC involved in any of this discussion? And then the last piece was municipal drinking water supply. Again, the holiday farm fire, the City of Eugene's exclusive water source is the McKenzie River watershed. And as most of roughly 25% of that watershed burned. So that has an impact on Eugene's water supply, as well as future hazards for changing the flood regime, the water quality regime, overall just how all those systems interplay. So just curious if SB 762 and the work that you're looking at is incorporating any of those other topics that I tossed out there. Thank you.
Matt, can you weigh in on that question from Ken about those utilities and the water quality and water supply and those sort of things?
So Senate Bill 762 is a big bill, and sometimes called the omnibus bill, has a lot of different provisions, and I don't know all of them in detail. I know that utilities, electrical utilities, are addressed in the bill. I think largely as as a potential point of ignition for fires and ways to address that, but that's not something that at DLCD that we really deal with directly. So while we try to keep coordinated with other agencies, we do. Each agency has their own specialty and their own area of authority. So that's not something that we work with on them.
But, I would say that, I think the issue that's behind all that is the issue of coordination with lots of different state agencies and partners. And that's been a common theme that we've heard throughout these listening sessions. So I'll help frame your question, Ken, as more of an issue for the DLCD and other state agencies to consider as they form recommendations to how to address the wildfire risk, because that again, it's not any one agency, it's multiple agencies and partners who are involved in the effort. Jason, it looks like you have your hand up.
Sorry, I'm just really curious and trying to learn as much as I can. Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a baseline set of information for these listening sessions that we can maybe go to after this is all done and learn a little bit more. I think from my perspective, it would be good to know what communities are required to do currently regarding wildfire risk in terms of mapping and any kind of regulations that go along with that. And if that's a simple answer, that there are no maps and there are no regulations, that would be good to know. Or if we're sorely out of step with what the state law requires, that would be good to know as well.
Right.
Now,
The short answer is goal 5, or goal 7, as you already mentioned, that goal 7 requires cities and counties to inventory the hazard and then make decisions about what you're going to do on a local level. And I guess the question that we're looking at the land conservation development is, should there be more? And so we take your input. Should there be more requirements on a state level, or should there be different requirements? What do you think?
yeah, and that question goes out to everyone. So I guess that's a good way to frame it is, should there be more of a statewide or, more requirements, more incentives, those types of things. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Jason, I don't know if your hand's still up or if it's just left over from. But you're welcome to chime in. Well, I guess I'm surprised. The question of around regulations and requirements is usually a challenging one. So I'm curious what folks think about that approach. If there are thoughts about regulations and requirements, what they might look like, or if you're opposed to them and why, what you might offer as an additional alternative. Susan.
I think sometimes it's really difficult because I think you can have like minimal requirements, but I really think that there's a difference in different communities. What's needed rurally may not be what's needed urbanly. And so I think they have to be kind of general and enough that communities get to decide, what's more relevant for their communities. And so I think you need to be really careful when you start having restrictions or requirements that can't be met maybe in some particular areas. So, having some guidance around what would help you be more resilient or more fire wise, or however you want to put it, is good, but it also might be very different in different areas. So I think you have to be careful with that. You don't want to set people up for failure. And I think you need to look at it in terms of how can you make these communities more successful in lessening their risks. So to me, that's a really tough one.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and one that we've heard before as well, that you have to consider context, whether you're in urban, rural environment, that there's not a one size fits all approach throughout the entire state. Anyone else have any final thoughts? I'm going to try to summarize things a bit here in terms of our discussion, but if you want to chime in, you raise your hand, and let me know if you think I'm off base. But in terms of kind of overall summary, I think some of the issues that we heard were balancing competing goals and objectives, where you want to have the land available for housing and economic development, but also manage the risks, and that's a big issue. The issue of transportation related to evacuation, getting people in and out in a safe manner. I think I also heard about impacts to communities that rely on tourism, and what how wildfire really impacts those communities. And I think the issue of coordination came up, about what are all the different agencies and partners doing and who has jurisdiction over what. That certainly seems to be a reoccurring issue. And then lastly, as Susan brought up about, not a one-size-fits-all approach, that you have to consider the community, whether it's urban or rural, and what the risk levels are for those communities. Some of the solutions I heard were, the good communication. Again, Susan had the example of the particular crew that was working in her community, had community meetings and postings, and so that getting the people that live and work there informed about the level of risk and what they need to know in order to make a decision or evacuate. Also talked about grants, using a incentive approach to get people to change their surroundings, whether they're clearing or remodeling, converting wood shakes to composite roofs, siding, etc. And then I think I also heard about, this is an opportunity for education, that the example from Lane County where staff were going out and doing assessments and educating homeowners and landowners about what they could do to reduce their level of risk. Did I leave anything out? Matt or Aubrey, anything else that you heard that need to highlight?
I think you hit the high points from the notes that I'm taking as well, Chris.
Maybe an observation, not so much I heard, is that I did hear from several people really listening, and I noticed that there's I don't know, half a dozen people who are here who also seem to be listening and haven't yet come up to an answer, and so that's okay. That people are really interested and want to know more about this, but don't have answers yet. That's one of the takeaways I'm taking from this.
Yeah, that's a good point. That maybe there's people need to know more and learn more, and able to be able to understand, so that they can make informed comments. And I see Trisha is back. Trisha, I have us at about, okay, well, we're wrapping up. Do you mind if our group comes back a little bit early, unless anyone else has anything else they'd like to add? I think we're
feel free to go get a drink of water or something.
Yeah,
I'll be back in there. All right, thank you. All
right, well, again, I wanted to thank everyone for coming today and participating. I know it's a challenging subject with lots of moving parts, so we definitely appreciate the input that everyone provided, and then also wanted to acknowledge that folks that were here to listen and learn as well, that was equally educational to us. So
first and foremost, of course, welcome to our breakout room. My name is Martin Bartlett from Barney and Worth, and I'll be facilitating in this breakout room today. You see my colleague Tammy, who will be taking notes on our discussion today. And as she mentioned as well, that this breakout room, just like the main room, is also being recorded. We also have a couple of representatives from DLCD in the room. I'm going to go ahead and ask Catherine to please introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Daniel. I'm a natural hazards planner with DLCD, and I'm currently working in Tillamook County.
And I also see that Commissioner Warren has joined us in the room.
Hi, everybody. Excited to hear what you have to say.
So we're going to go ahead and dive on in. And just a reminder for everybody who, I know we were all in that big room a minute ago, but the best way to go ahead and be recognized is go ahead and virtually raise your hand if you have something to say, or you can put your response in the chat to offer suggestions or ask questions there as well. When you are recognized, please take a second to introduce yourself to the group and also let us know which group you might represent. So all told, we have about 35 minutes for brainstorming and then 10 minutes reserved for a report back to the larger group. So what we'll do is towards the end of the session, we'll really kind of get down to working on some consensus about what are the big takeaways from our group. So again, we're here to collect your ideas and suggestions about the ways to address wildfire risks in state and local land use planning programs. So really want to be as interactive as possible and really hear from as many of you in the room as possible. So with that, I'll ask, are there any questions about kind of the rules of the road for our breakout room? All right, seeing none, hearing none, we will go ahead and dive right on in. So I guess the first thing we want to do is, again, kind of go back to those two big questions that we're asking. Just a reminder, those two questions are, what issues do you feel are most important when considering wildlife risk, or rather wildfire risk? And also the other big question is, what solutions would you like to see implemented to protect from wildfire risk? So with that, I'm going to go ahead, open the floor. Anybody, please feel free, go ahead, raise your hand. And what are the answers to those questions from where you sit? Peggy was quick on the draw. Go ahead, Peggy, if you can go ahead.
Many people know me, so they know that, and I really want to get the conversation started. So that's why I jumped in. So a couple of the things that I have heard people talk about that are really important. We have to figure out ways to get at all Oregonians, which means we have lots of canyons and places where we don't have good broadband. I'm hopeful that the broadband money that we provided, that the legislature provided, will help with that. But we need to figure out, make sure that we have good communication. An alternative is another idea that I have heard, and that's using signage, as we do with the tsunamis at the Oregon coast, to say that this is an evacuation zone, a wildfire evacuation zone. So those are a couple of ideas. I am certainly supportive of hardening. I am supportive of the defensible space issues, all of which are also being discussed already. So I'll let somebody else speak.
I'm muted, but we are off to a great start. So who wants to follow that up? Go ahead, please raise your hand if you don't mind. I will say that idea of marked evacuation routes is one that we've heard come up over and over and over again. So I'm curious if anybody has any further feedback specific to that, only because it's something we've heard both as a pro and as a con in some of the different listening sessions we've done.
Well, everyone is concerned. I'm going to keep talking. Everyone is concerned about the about not devaluing their property by having such things as these signages. But the truth is, in the tsunami zone area, people have simply accepted that that is a concern that people need to be aware of. And there are certain areas, particularly, again, those canyon areas and in places where we do not have any kind of communication, we need to make sure that we address that issue.
Ask me to put the two questions in the chat. Let me go ahead and do that. I think that's an absolutely excellent idea. So you'll have to bear with me for just a moment.
Catherine, maybe you could kind of help kick off some conversation as well about some of the things that possibly you've been hearing.
Sure. Well, evacuation is certainly a big topic when it comes to discussing with communities what what they would like to see happen to mitigate the risk of wildfire. So, communication goes right along with that, I think, Peggy. So I'm not sure if other we're talking about perhaps aspects of risk reduction that can be addressed by land use mechanisms. So, zoning codes and that sort of aspect is also something that we've heard people talk about in other sessions. Not sure if that sparks thoughts.
A comment in the chat. I'd be interested to know if DLCD has any initial ideas / thoughts regarding what is possible to include in the October recommendation menu. I'm sorry, memo.
I have to admit being somewhat ill-prepared to answer that specific question because I am not directly involved in this project, but I am a natural hazards planner and have worked with folks from Wallowa County, Grant County, Baker County, City of Albany, and currently in Tillamook County, discussing in general wildfire reduction and mitigation actions. So I'm not sure I'm able to answer that question directly.
Another thing that we heard in some of our other listening sessions that I think was particularly interesting is this idea of regional adaptability. I'd be very interested to hear from folks in the group about that idea, how resonant that is. How important is it that whatever comes out of this exercise is ultimately tailor-made at really kind of a micro level? Amber, go ahead.
Well, excuse me. I just think, you know, it would be nice if whatever comes out of the recommendations, that there is some flexibility for local jurisdictions to determine standards if ultimately this leads to some sort of recommendation to change the statewide planning program or the land use codes that apply statewide and that we're obligated to implement. There's some sort of flexibility that we can work with local fire districts and work with local communities to develop standards that tailor to local communities and the very different landscapes across Oregon. But at the same time, I say that and also think it would be nice to have some consistency statewide or from county to county, because that just, I think, helps developers navigate from county to county and have some consistency and know, you know, if they work in multiple jurisdictions. It also helps us to be able to implement standards and have some collaboration with other jurisdictions to develop standards that are not just unique to one county.
Any other thoughts specific to that idea of kind of local adaptability? So a question, I believe, to Amber would be, would that involve changes to the Goal 7 language?
Possibly, yeah, that, I'm sorry, I'm thinking a little bit, but that could be one way to provide some guidance statewide. I'd see that that would make some sense.
Mary Ann, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Amber was saying. I think it does make sense to have the regulations be maybe not the same, but similar county to county, because I know that for a lot of folks, it might be. So I'm thinking of particularly like defensible space. If there was a regulation in every county that defined what defensible space looked like and how it had to be maintained, I've heard from a lot of folks that it's pretty difficult to maintain their defensible space and that they spend a lot of time, you know, clearing away blackberries and trying to make sure that it is defensible. If that were a state requirement or a consistent county requirement, I wonder if there might be more ability to help with funding those sorts of things, or having various nonprofit groups kind of help with that stuff if it were more on a statewide level.
I have a follow-up question for you. Would that be, what about on a regional level versus a county or state level?
Yeah, I think any of those make sense, but I think the broader it is, it's just more, it's easier for folks to access resources, I think, if everybody kind of has to manage it.
Just go ahead and read that anyone can take it to try to answer. Can you explain what is being proposed to enforce the defensible space restrictions? Fire districts, people do not like private property rights taken away. I see this as a potential infringement on personal property rights. Another question we have coming in via the chat is, are community wildfire protection plans on the horizon? I'll go ahead and throw that out to the group and kind of see where that thread takes us. We know that there's a lot of concern about private property rights when we have conversations like this. So very curious to hear from the group kind of how do we balance knowing that there are legitimate needs kind of on both sides. Go ahead.
Christopher has his hand raised.
Go ahead. I'm afraid you're still muted.
Got to do it once a day. I'm Chief Heppel. I'm the Deputy Chief of Strategic Services for Eugene Springfield Fire. And that question comes up. Our understanding, and I can't speak for the Office of State Fire Marshal, is that they will be the agency responsible for enforcement. I really don't see local departments, specifically municipalities or fire districts enforcing this particular case because it's not adopted down to their level. The defensible space piece will be a state rule or OAR or however that piece rolls in there. It's not that I understand it will be adopted simply by the fire code. So that's what we anticipate, and that our regional deputies would be the enforcement piece when it came to the defensible space piece, but subject to change.
That's why they got 38 more people in the Office of the Fire Marshal. So besides natural hazards and just general zoning codes, I think people are struggling with what else is within the jurisdiction of DLCD.
Catherine, maybe you could take that one.
I wish that Susan and Sadie were in this room and could respond to your questions better than I. The question makes it sound like comprehensive plans and zoning code are small potatoes. I'm not sure okay. They are certainly changes to either of those types of documents are heavy lifts. And so I don't think that their impact should be discounted. As to what other areas DLCD has sort of jurisdiction over, we're very big on providing guidance. You know, you've heard the carrot and the stick. We much prefer the carrot. So financial incentives may also be a part of the types of tools that could be used outside of zoning code and comp plan updates. And as you've seen, this is SB 762 involves 11 different agencies. So we are but one of those.
I guess one of the things that I'll mention that might, again, maybe it's outside of DLCD's purview, but to the question about what issues do you feel are most important when considering wildfire risk, I work with a lot of folks whose houses were destroyed in the Holiday Farm fire, and the fire didn't pick and choose. It impacted everybody, but the people who are having a really hard time rebuilding are people with fewer economic resources. And so, again, I don't know if that's something that DLCD can have any impact on, but it is a real barrier for people who didn't own their properties, who were renting, who were underinsured. I mean, the list goes on about what people are struggling with, but people with more resources are having a much easier time rebuilding. And so, you know, I think that's an important issue, is just the economic disparities between people that make it harder.
Very much. Yeah, I really appreciate that feedback. I'm also curious, if Amber, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, I just noticed a comment that Peggy put into the chat, stating that as we see the new WUI maps, we need to consider how those maps affect zoning. And I think that could be a really important piece that should be explored. You know, once the maps are adopted, are there any potential changes that should be looked at in OAR 660 in certain divisions? Are there certain uses that should be modified at all to consider the WUI mapping and defensible space standards? And or should, you know, we've just went through a few years ago an update to our forest siting standards, and we're looking to 1991 recommendations for some of those siting standards. So, you know, is there anything there that should be amended or looked at, taking into account the WUI maps? So I think Peggy had a good point there.
Go ahead and recognize me.
Hello, everyone. Sorry to interrupt. About 15 minutes left.
So thank you, Amber. That's exactly what I was trying to get at. So for many of you, I follow all of this stuff. I worked on Senate Bill 762 and follow most of what's happening. So I just was trying to prompt people to see what kinds of conversations and how they really feel about what would happen if DLCD determined that it was important to link the WUI map, particularly the high and extreme risk areas, with some sort of zoning, comp plan or zoning change. And Catherine, I believe in comp plans and zoning. I do a lot of that and have since 1972. So another issue might be in the discussion that was just had about the fact that people with lower income or were underinsured or were renters now do not have homes. So some of us work to try to get some additional monies at the legislature, but there are permitting issues that relate really to other agencies, but they are linked to rebuilds. So we need to be looking at sewer and water systems, drinking water systems. We need to link what is needed in a community and not just focus on the one plot of land. It really needs to be a whole of community discussion, I guess is what I'm hoping that we will get out of this. And last thing is a discussion of a region, except for the East and the West on each side of the Cascades. In Oregon, a county is a county is a county. We have tried regional discussions, and the truth is that each county really wants to be its own voice. And I doubt very much if we could divide the state into regions to be able to do any kind of rulemaking, because there are grasslands in Eastern Oregon, just as there are forest lands. There are all kinds of different lands, and they really are very, very local.
I want to touch on the whole of community conversation, because you touched on something that we've heard it's scattered and very kind of far in between, talk of infrastructure. So what roles should infrastructure play in this conversation? A really good example that we had in a conversation yesterday that we didn't really get to dig into as much as I'd hoped to, was this idea of, it's great that, you know, we are requiring a more modern amount of infrastructure. For example, the example I was used was fire hydrants. But are we having a serious conversation about how was the entire system built? Maybe it was built for standards 40 years ago that it had one set of assumptions. So it's great that you have a fire hydrant on the corner, but if all that other infrastructure hasn't been updated and upgraded and the standards haven't been changed, then it really doesn't make too much of a difference.
So I'll jump in, and I hope maybe some of the local people can discuss this. This is the conversation that I'm having with the legislature. We have a housing issue as well. And the truth is that as you try to develop property, the cost of infrastructure is so great that we are having a difficult time finding even middle cost housing, let alone affordable housing. And so we need to be looking at whole systems about how we fund infrastructure. Since Measure 5 and 4750, our property tax system has limited the ability for local governments to be able to do that subsidy. And if you are talking about $100,000 a lot, it's just not going to happen. The other thing we want to make sure of is that where possible, we can have systems versus individual sewer septic tanks. We have discovered that the Holiday Farm Fire people here, I'm sure, the Santiam people, both, those septic systems were right on the river, built years and years ago. And anytime we can, as a state, say it's in our collective best interest to help fund those things, we need to take a look at that. So.
I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Do you mind if I jump in here? If I raise my hand, not being called on. My name's Althea Sullivan. I'm one of the senior planners with the city of Eugene. In thinking about how all of this ties together, I think it's really interesting talking about the maps and how those will impact our buildable land supply, especially when it comes to changes that I suspect we'll start seeing this upcoming summer and next year with the House Bill 2001 and middle housing going in, and how that plays into changes in infrastructure and the cost of property. So I guess that's kind of there's a lot of things going on with that. And kind of my question for you all maybe is sort of, are there thoughts with how this project is moving forward in trying to tie some of these different pieces together? And kind of looking at it from more of a comprehensive standpoint rather than additional things that are being asked of cities. I think it's really important work, but I would love if it pointed to all of these other things that are happening too, which I know is challenging.
Double applause, not the applause emoji, but also the actual applause. Does anyone in the room want to kind of take up that mantle and talk a little bit about kind of that comprehensive, holistic need?
Okay, land use planning is about where we live, work, shop, and play, and how we get there. That's what land use planning is all about. It's not all of these narrow rules and regulations and comp plans and development codes. It's really about people and about where we live, work, shop, and play, and how we get there. And that's exactly what I was trying to get at. So, Alika, I thank you for your comments.
And I'll also say, I know I just asked like a very large question there. So maybe it's just putting it out there as something to float around in the back of your head as this project is moving forward too.
I just wanted to say I am ill-equipped to answer the question, but I think posing the question is certainly something that Susan Millhauser, the individual who's writing the report for DLCD, would like to hear.
curious from the group, are there any thoughts about that idea of maybe some specifics on what specifically should be talking to one another? Anything we can kind of help kind of flesh that out? I think it's a very interesting point. And that, to your point, there's a lot to talk about there. What are some other areas that we might want to make sure are all talking to each other?
I'm happy to add a little bit more context to my question there. I think thinking about kind of the housing crisis that we're seeing in Oregon and different mandates that have come in the form of different House bills to really open up the allowance for housing. I'm thinking about our buildable land supply and where we have room to place that housing and to what extent changes or kind of the adoption of additional requirements for defensible space may actually result in a decrease in the footprint of land that's, truly available for use, whether that's housing or other uses. I know housing is the talk these days, so I figured I'd go with that example.
Some of the climate friendly and equitable communities discussion includes the discussion on making sure that we have sidewalks, etc. There are lots within cities that developers could use the sidewalks so they don't have to pay for them, where we could perhaps continue to increase the development within communities as you're working with that middle housing effort. The other thing I want to bring up really quickly is water. And you talked about having fire hydrants. The truth is you got to have water to get to those fire hydrants. And we have a drought situation in Oregon and it will not get better. So as we're trying to figure out how to build our safe communities related to wildfire, we need to figure out a nexus with the water situation.
Go ahead.
I don't know that I have an answer to Althea's question. We don't, and I apologize, I don't think I mentioned earlier, I'm the planning director for Lane County. So we don't, other than working with the cities for adoption or co-adoption of comprehensive plans, we don't do buildable land inventories outside of our jurisdiction, outside of urban growth boundaries. But something that kind of comes to mind is, and I'm just thinking out loud here, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Lane County, but the intersection of the defensible space standards again, and other zoning requirements for rural lands. And I wonder if there's maybe an opportunity to look at siting standards combined with defensible space requirements to look at something like clustering, where you have defensible space surrounding a cluster of residential densities. And again, I'm just thinking out loud here a little bit.
So that means we have to make sure that we have the buildings are built in a safe manner so that having a cluster of buildings together have the right building codes.
If I can raise my hand, and thanks for mentioning that, Amber. That kind of got a thought in my brain as well. A lot of our properties have some sort of setback already required. Of course, it's a little bit different from a defensible space where you're going from the edges of your property towards your house, as opposed to going from your property or your house towards the edges of your property. And I wonder, as different defensible space options are being considered, if there's a way to look at writing that in a way to somehow maybe give credit for those other places on property where regulation already reduces the actual buildable area as of a lot. Or perhaps a cap to the amount that defensible space could reduce the buildable area of a given lot when considering other setback requirements.
But aren't setback requirements local? So that's something that you all have control over, right?
They would be local. I was just thinking of, gosh, what was it? I think Senate Bill 8 and House Bill 2000, I forget the name of it, but the emergency shelter superseding bill as well, where it sort of overrode local provisions. So if there was something that kind of provided a, you know, these requirements would apply, but not to exceed a certain amount of this lot area becoming that.
Because the other part has to do with climate change and the need for trees and green, and not just have buildings taking over lots of the lot. So I thank you.
This is a question that'll kind of turn the conversation on its head a little bit. We talked a lot about what our ideas are. What are some things that would be kind of unacceptable coming out of the process? What are some things that the group or that those in the group don't want to see come out as a possible solution? Amber, go ahead.
Sorry again to jump in.
No, please.
You know, the couple things that pop into my head in response to that are if we had really short timelines to implement, if there were rule changes, and just, you know, it would be nice to have some guidance or resources to support counties to implement if there are rule changes, to implement those standards, because it will take some time, and will take us some time to strategize and find the staffing to roll things out.
So would a model code help like they did with the 2001?
I think that could be helpful. Going back to my earlier point, I think it would be helpful to have some identified areas where there's room for flexibility to adapt to local circumstances.
Thank you. If we were in a room, we would all be having this conversation, and Zoom is sort of frustrating related to that. And that's why I keep jumping in. I hope others will do the same.
Well, I'll take your prompt there, Peggy. I would just second what Amber mentioned as far as it relates to cities. So apply it to cities and counties.
To kind of sum it up, the idea of give us, you know, a clear expectation and then a realistic timeline, clear and realistic.
Absolutely. And I would just add, considering the other timelines that are coming out of other efforts related to changes.
Anything else? I think those are very insightful points and very interesting. I'm very curious, is there anything else that anyone else in the group would just not like to see come out as a possible solution?
Only about 5 minutes to wrap up, maybe a little bit less.
Thanks, Trish.
So for us, it's time to kind of come to some consensus on what are some of the most important things, maybe the most important 2 or 3 things we discussed. So I've been furiously taking notes this whole time. So I'm very curious to hear kind of from the group, what would you say are the 2 or 3 big takeaways that we want to report back out to the main group here in about 5 minutes?
The whole discussion that I heard was around, in particular from jurisdictions, was around making sure that if there is a requirement around changing the comp plan or zoning codes, that there be time to do that, that perhaps there is a model code with options to be able to help. And I suspect they would also say funding around those issues. The other one I'd like to make sure that gets in is the whole business about making sure that we deal with communication and evacuation issues.
See, we have from Amber in the chat, connection with other regulations / programs / zoning, time and resources. So I think that really goes to the idea of also take a comprehensive view of all that's being asked across the state and recognize, though this is incredibly important, it's not the only thing that jurisdictions are being asked to implement. So is it okay if we go out with this idea of making sure that if there's a requirement, that there's time to implement it, make sure that we deal with the communication and evacuation issues, and also that idea of giving jurisdictions or recognizing on behalf of jurisdictions that their plates are already pretty full. Do those feel like 3 good points to take out? That idea, okay, I just see Amber dropped in the chat, that idea of guidance, but local flexibility. So we'll go ahead and we'll include that. Because we did hear about flexibility, this idea of flexibility and consistency. So there is some tension there, but I think, do we worry about taking that out? Is there consensus to this idea? We want to at least have something we can know is, stalwart across the board, even though there may be different local flavors. Does that kind of sum it up? Okay, because they're counting me down. We have 45 seconds left, and then we're all going to magically teleport back into the main room. Well, if I don't do a good job of summing it up, please don't hesitate to call me out when we get back into the main group. Y'all have been a pleasure to work with today. I really appreciate all of the conversation, and I will see everybody back in the main room in half a minute.
Yeah, thank you all for the discussion. It was great.
All right, I am also going to be taking notes today, so I'm also going to be recording the breakout room so I can go back and make sure that I catch everything that we discuss here today. So that recording is started. Please raise your hand or use chat to speak, offer suggestions, ask questions, and please remember to introduce yourself and the group you represent when you're speaking. Again, the 2 questions are: what issues do you feel are most important when considering wildfire risks? In other groups, people have had some experience with the wildfires and have related that to solutions that they would like to see in place. But any comments or suggestions that you have, questions, we would appreciate it. And with that, we will open up for the first participant.
Court Boyce, Curry County Commissioner. No comments at this time, but thank you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for joining us.
I'm
Susan,
Mayor of Lincoln City.
welcome.
I think our biggest issue is evacuation routes.
Okay.
Pretty limited in how we can leave town. And in September of 2020, we had lots of issues.
Would you mind just talking a little bit more about what the issues were? Because we've heard.
Oh, okay. One of our main routes, well, our only main route east was through the fire. So we couldn't go that way. And then the fire came west far enough that it was close to 101. So we couldn't go north. The other issue is the county and the city both had bridge work being done at the same time, so people couldn't go south by those routes. So everyone had to be funneled onto 101 close to the fire in order to head south, so that the people who were in the north end of town being held up because the people who were closest to the fire were being routed down 101. But there wasn't the communication to let the people at the north end of town know what was happening. We were stuck in traffic for 3 hours, seeing the fire get closer and closer and not being able to get out.
That is, must have been very scary. That
It was. A lot of people.
When you think about the DLCD effort here and sets of solutions, you know, what ideas does your community have about evacuation routes?
We're looking for them.
Okay.
There are some options that cost a lot of money. One of our routes that might have been useful at that time goes through city property and county property, and we will probably have to annex some county in order to have the route available to do the construction if and when we ever get the money for it.
So you will have the option there is a brand new route out of your city.
Right, a brand new connection between 101 and 18.
Joshua, did you have something you'd like to say?
Sorry to join you late. I didn't quite
welcome.
catch the question. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, the question, discussion questions are, what are the issues that are most important to you related to this topic? And what solutions would you like to see implemented, or what concerns do you have? You know, we're looking from everybody for advice. Whatever's top of mind for you about this topic, Sadie and John would love to hear it. We know it's a big, complex topic.
Yeah.
And Joshua, just for the benefit of the folks in the room, you're the Douglas County Planning Director, and you also are, what's your role with AOCPD? Are you the?
I'm the president for 2022.
And I'm sorry, folks, the Association of Oregon County Planning Directors group. So that's a group of all the planning directors around the state. And we're fortunate to have Joshua here because he's trying to keep that group in line.
Yeah. Yeah. And just FYI, I'm also serving on the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. So I'm in the thick of things. And of course, you're probably aware, but Douglas County was affected by a fire in the fall of 2020, Archie Creek Fire, which was pretty devastating to one of the local communities here. So it's definitely top of mind, and we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about this topic here in Douglas County. Yeah, let me think about.
Okay, I was wondering, Sadie, we have there's 11 participants. What would you, maybe we could go around the room and introduce ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Maybe I'll call on people. Colin Beck.
Hey, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, my name's Colin Beck. I'm the Forest Lands Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Layute Indians.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
thank you. Pat? You're muted. I'll come back to you, Kim. Oh, you're muted too.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Travis, and I work for Oregon Housing and Community Services. And I'm really here today to listen as we are putting together an action plan for HUD funding to support the 2020 wildfire recovery. And so just wanting to make sure that we're tracking this process, and if there are some things that we can and should incorporate into the action plan for the HUD funds, we want to make sure we're doing that. So thank you for allowing me to listen in.
Yep. Crystal? Hello, welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm Crystal Shoji. I'm from Coos Bay. I'm a private contractor. I have my own business, Shoji Planning. And I work for several cities, and I'm just here to listen. We haven't had problems on this part of the coast at this time. That doesn't mean we won't. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Lance? All right, well, Hillary, I see you are here with us.
Hi, this is Hillary. I'm DLCD staff and participating from Northern Tillamook County today.
Thank you. And there's somebody on a phone. I know sometimes those are hard to set up to be able to speak, but the 541-999-1122. You would like to introduce yourself?
Hello?
Yay. Hello, welcome.
Okay, hello. Yes. My name is Colleen Higgins, and I am a city councilor for Lakeside, which is on the southern Oregon coast. And I'm just here to listen as well, because we're putting together plans on what to do in case we have an emergency. We haven't had one yet, but it could happen. We're on the edge of the Elliott State Forest, so we want to make sure nothing happens there either.
Okay. And then Rhonda? We'll see.
And Libby, Pat Holiday put in the chat that unfortunately she doesn't have a microphone, but
Okay.
she lives in Grant County.
Yep.
She serves on the County Planning Commission, and she's here to listen.
Good, thank you. Thanks very much. So it sounds like a number of you are here to listen and to learn. I wonder if it's possible to share questions that you might have for DLCD. Sadie is here, Hillary and John. We could, if it's not a set of solutions, Sadie, are you up for taking questions about the process? And
Absolutely, and I have some great backup here, so I will proceed unafraid. I would say, just for the benefit of this group, one of the questions we're hearing a lot in these is kind of about communication from the state to local governments about what's happening, when it's happening, who's doing what. We've also heard about the need for folks to know what resources are available now, what resources are going to be available in the future, when, that kind of stuff. And then we've heard a lot about the Department of Forestry map that is being developed by Oregon State University. That will be available June 30th. And so John and I served on the RAC, and I was his alternate for that. So we're happy to answer what questions we can about the process that went into creating that map.
Kim.
Yeah, I guess I have a question about how the map will be used once it's completed on June 30th.
Well, I'll take a stab at it, and John, Hillary, fill in what I leave out. So the way that it is designed to work in Senate Bill 762 is to give the Oregon State Fire Marshal and the Building Codes Division from DCBS guidance on where to target the investments that were made available to those organizations by identifying properties that were at extreme or high fire risk. And then in addition to those two categories, extreme and high fire risk, because the funding is not really limited to those groups, OSFM and DCBS, I think maybe it's just OFSM, can use a layer of the map that identifies what are being called socially and economically vulnerable communities to target funding to help assist those community members in creating and adhering to the defensible space guidelines that are set by the State Fire Marshal. So that's how the map is being used on June 30. But we DLCD is asked to consider how the map should be applied to local planning efforts. And that's part of the feedback that we're here to gather is how should we use that map? You know, what's important to consider? Should we use that map, right? So there's a lot of questions we have to answer about that.
I was thinking, Sadie, that some of the things that you brought up that we've heard from others too, that were, this is the 4th of 3 listening sessions that we've heard. So some of the other things were that, how do you align defensible space needs with density requirements, landscaping requirements, and tree removal restrictions on existing and future property. You know, idea that all of this work has to be done holistically. There's no magic bullet that for the outcome of this, or agencies across the board are going to have to be working together to find solutions. I think, Sadie, do you want to say something about how we heard about this, because it's fire and people, how much people play a role in making the community safe, even with.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have heard a lot in our other community listening sessions, and oh, hi, Lisa Arkin. And John and Hillary, please chime in on this. And Joshua, I think you've probably heard some of this too. So there's kind of a question about sort of the landowner responsibility for maintaining defensible space, the enforcement of, you know, the enforcement necessary to maintain defensible space. And of course, OSFM's enforcement would apply only to areas that were at extreme or high wildfire risk. So if a local government, a county or a city said, you know, we just have heard enough from the people that live here that we want to include people that are just at medium risk or at less risk than this high and extreme category because they're neighbors, right? It's the guy right there. So
sorry to interrupt, Katie. There's about 15 minutes left in the room. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. So, you know, if a local government were to decide that more comprehensive defensible space standards would apply throughout their community, you know, who's in charge then? And so those are some of the questions that we're trying to make recommendations that will guide future actions, both legislatively and for local governments.
I thought one other thing that from yesterday's meeting was an idea that any code that comes out of the process needs to be simple and clear. Sadie, that for various reasons, yeah.
And I would love to hear folks' thoughts on this, because I feel like we all can relate. We had an attendee at yesterday's meeting that really called DLCD out and said, land use code is complicated. It's difficult to interpret. It can be difficult to apply. And if we do not make the, whatever guidance or rules that result from DLCD's work, and really, I think this is a charge for the state as a whole, all the implementing agencies. If we don't make this accessible and easy to understand, then we sort of put people who can afford lawyers and expert advice and consultants at an advantage, and we put people who might otherwise voluntarily want to comply with this at a disadvantage by making it too difficult to follow. And we heard likewise from Chief Johnson, who is the fire chief in Sisters, that if we don't have consistent application of sort of safety enhancements that will reduce wildfire for our communities across the state, if we don't have something consistent, then we're going to make it harder for industry. We're going to make it harder for our volunteer firefighters because it's going to be uneven application. And that makes it that's sort of like our agritourism is right now, if folks are familiar. Well, probably only Hillary got that one. But, having differing standards, jurisdiction to jurisdiction or county to county can be problematic. That said, Senate Bill 762 does want us to take into account regional differences, right? So we should be able to treat coastal communities different than folks that are in Central Oregon or in the Portland metro area. So I think there's a question of how do we thread that needle in making it simple enough to be accessible and sort of meet our equity goals in that regard, but also allow for regional differences. So, and this is land use writ large, right? So if you have ideas about this, we are all ears and we would love to hear them.
Any questions or thoughts for Sadie?
Joshua, I feel like you hear about this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
One concern that's come up in our more recent wildfire programs advisory council meeting was the timing of the map as it's to be released. There's a public comment period coming up, but they let us know that the draft maps, we're not likely to see draft maps until mid-May at the very earliest. So it makes it challenging for people to participate in the public comment. The people that are potentially most affected won't know it until they look at their property on the map and may not participate, not knowing that they'll be more affected. And then someone that may choose to participate may see no effect. So it's just one of the challenges of Senate Bill 762, how it was designed. It's a good thing. It's aggressive. All the agencies that are participating are on very aggressive timelines, but I think this kind of thing might happen somewhere along the way where the review and the rolling out of these different reports and different products are going to be sort of a little bit challenging. So I guess I would say to everyone, keep an eye out for those draft maps. Keep your elected officials informed because they're going to be the ones that hear about this when the maps go into effect, most likely. And so, yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Colin, you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, this is Colin Beck with the Confederate Tribes. I don't know if this is the type of information you're looking for, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways. I see lack of access as a major obstacle to wildfire preparedness here on the coast. We need to make sure we're maintaining our forest roads so we have safe access in the event of a wildfire, and across all ownerships, private, federal, BLM and Forest Service, as well as tribal. I think this is especially an issue on some of our federal and tribal ownership, where we have a backlog of forest road maintenance needs. So I just wanted to put it out there that I see that as an issue.
Yeah, that's great. A great comment. Court, Commissioner Boyce.
You can just call me Court. Good day. Thank you all. Hey, good discussion. I don't think this is off topic, but and there's a reason we grow the greatest, highest quality, fastest growing trees on the planet. We also grow the fastest, most prolific ground fuel. And so just public campaigns to remind the people that not only do we grow those ground fuels, it's just really hard to keep it in control. And then this country, because of our climate, dries out so fast. You can have an incredible rain, and then 2 days later you're going, my goodness, we're walking in the brush here and it's crunchy. So just that PR, and we all are subject to often being complacent. Nobody wants to hear the skies falling, but with the droughts and the three things that make fire, and that is heat, fuel, and well, I'm drawing a blank on the third one, but anyway, fuel is the one we can control, and that's just something we have to constantly be reminded at all levels of government, all of our society, culture. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Heat, fuel, and oxygen. How could I forget oxygen?
Oxygen is very important.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
What a moment.
Yeah. That's great. Interesting from this group, Sadie, that two of the big topics are related to roads and building roads or maintaining roads. Is there something in the Senate bill related to that along the resource lines, or any insights?
No, but DLCD is asked to make recommendations about evacuation specifically, and we've heard that come in a couple of different shapes. So it's community education, language accessibility, and language or messaging in appropriate languages, so that everyone is informed, using messaging in common, using accessible platforms, but then also the infrastructure. And I think that has a relationship to the transportation system plans, which I know is planner jargon, but for our counties and for our cities. And I think that part of the recommendations, I would not be surprised if we do advance, will have a relationship to, the investment, or at least the identification of evacuation needs as we move forward, because we're pretty far away from anything that looks like rulemaking at this point. That would probably, that'll take place after the 2023 long session.
Yeah. Thank you, Sadie. We have, is your name, is it Karen? Corrine?
Corrine rhymes with Marine.
Corrine.
Hi, everybody. Washington County Land Use and Transportation. So my question is about if there's been any kind of consideration of how wildfire risk mitigation might interact with some of our other goals, right? So this is to me, very much squarely in goal 7, it's hazards. But some of the things we talk about, like improving roadway access, means like construction activity and expansions of road systems into habitat areas. We also have to consider goal 5, natural resources. And it does seem like there is a pretty big overlap. And there's some of this already, but between, our wildfire areas and some of our big game areas. So there are these two competing resources, and how do we weigh and balance this? And is that something that's going to be considered by DLCD in these report recommendations?
That's a good question, Karine. And I'll let John pick up anything that I miss. I would say kind of. At this point, the recommendations that we anticipate making are pretty broad. And I think that level of detail would probably be more present in a rulemaking exercise that would follow with legislative direction, because that's where we really are getting into how the rubber's going to hit the road and what those different goal interactions are. But we are sort of conscientious about it and conscious of it as a staff, the interaction with our urbanization goals, with our transportation goals, housing goals, as you were pointing out, goal 5, natural resources, habitat, stuff like that. So we know that there is an interaction. Just how and where our recommendations interact with those different goals is kind of TBD. And in part, that is a result of the timeline that we're on, which is fairly aggressive. John, did you want to fill anything in?
No, I think that's right. As I see a bunch of planners out here and the local partners, and so we have a lot of things to consider. That's one of the things we're not advocates for any one particular thing. I've often envied my colleagues with agencies like the Department of Agriculture, Department of Forestry, or they focus on one thing. We focus on a bunch of things, right? To the extent that there appears to be a conflict between these goals, the goals need to be read together and harmonized. Mm-hmm. And that's best done in a deliberate, transparent rulemaking process. We're not there yet. We don't know quite how we're going to get there, which makes our role a little different than some of our other partners. Where the state fire marshal has said, okay, you'll do defensible space, but they're also directed to an area of the International Wildland Urban Interface Code, to a similar extent, building codes, and also even Department of Forestry. We're pretty open-ended. We're just saying, okay, you guys, take a look at all this and then come back and see where it goes. And we're talking about the built environment where there are already presence of structures and investment infrastructure, the kind of the planned environment, where those items are going to be in the future. It's been decided, those choices have been made, as well as changes. What happens with regards to upzoning areas or urban growth boundary expansions or things like that. So there's a multitude of facets to think about. I'm really happy to hear that the question about what about density and defensible space? Bingo, right? Well, those are the kind of things. I think there's an answer for that. But those are the kind of things that we need to try to understand. And again, I'm gonna repeat. I'll tie this off, I promise. But I'm gonna repeat what I asked earlier. With all our partners out there, and Karine and Joshua and Commissioner Boyce and Mayor Susan and all you guys are at the local level, help us understand this, right? We need your help. Both in identifying what kinds of things our state and local programs can and should do, but also what it would mean to implement those items. What kind of burden would it be? Financial, staff, other, time. Anything's possible. It just takes time and money, right? But please help us understand what that universe looks like. Don't need to answer today. This isn't a one-off. Mm-hmm. But just again, we're really wanting to hear from you, and we really need your help. So thank you.
Well,
that's
so that's
5
really
minutes to wrap up.
Just a few minutes left, Trish. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
So John's answer was really helpful. And if there was absent any other questions, if there was other guidance on what do you think would be helpful for us to bring back to you sooner rather than later, I understand that part. Richard did a great job with that. Yeah, what else can we tell you about? So burdens of possible implementation. What else do you want to know from the local implementers?
I have a question that I think is related to what John was saying. And one of the big charges for DLCD is figuring out how to use this statewide wildfire risk map and the WUI sort of overlay that is going to exist within that tool set in local planning. And one of the concerns we heard in an earlier community listening session was from folks, and I could imagine this could apply to some of our coastal cities, that they were concerned that they weren't going to be high or extreme, and that the resources that are available were going to all be dedicated to folks that were at high or extreme risk, and they were going to be left behind. So they weren't going to have targeted funding for, you name it, XYZ. And so, you know, if that's a concern, you know, I think we would want to know about that, because that maybe tells us something about how the map should function or shouldn't at a local government level. And any other thoughts are welcome, I think, John.
So I would love to receive ideas about an arrangement of whether we're talking about a regulatory arrangement, whether we're talking about voluntary, incentive-based, combination thereof. What, you know, in your judgment, would culminate in the highest likelihood for success. That's what we want. You know, we want to protect our communities and our people and our investments from wildland fire, and it's getting worse. And again, you guys have probably the best sense of what some of that could be, and our tribal partners too. You know, we want to hear from our other nations, and so again, you know, those sorts of things. What could it look like? What would it take to implement? Because, you know, we don't want to come back with an empty bag and say, okay, guys, here you go do it. And we want to, this is a partnership. We want to be united, right? And that means, you know, knowing what it's going to take to be able to carry it out.
Mm-hmm.
I understood that some communities have already begun some planning around this. Yesterday's meeting, Deschutes County was describing their safe evacuation route program. A very robust program it appeared to be. Is there anybody in our group today who's already started planning and have ideas based on that work? I know, Susan, you guys are looking for solutions. Yeah. Well, when we go back to the main room here shortly, there'll be a report out. I will just give a summary of our discussion today. Is there anything any of you would like to make sure that I summarize? Anything you want to make sure that the whole group hears? I know I will talk about roads, evacuation routes, about how the map will be used and the need for DLCD to get feedback from the local communities about what it will take to implement any recommendations.
Yeah, I think that the maintenance of roads that Colin Beck brought up,
yeah, thanks,
and the way that our federal partners, our tribal nations, and ODF and other all those Forest Service roads, the way we all need to work together to make sure that those are effective ways of keeping people safe and providing evacuation routes.
All right, I think we can go back into the main room. If you, can everybody see on the bottom right of their screen, it says leave room. If you leave the room, we will all reconvene in the big room.
Outstanding.
Right. See everybody there. So we're going to take a few minutes to do a report. The report back to the group. Kim, are you gonna assign us who goes first?
Yeah, I'll even volunteer.
All right.
I can go first.
Thank you.
So I think I can boil down our top solutions and things that we talked about to resource constraints and communications. And when we talked about resource constraints, it was everything from not having funding for low-income homeowners to be able to harden their homes, to unincorporated communities having challenges with recovery and that placing a higher burden on those local school districts, because that's the only government entity that is there. Talked about funding availability for, oh, I'm losing my notes. Yeah, but and then difficulty getting gear for firefighters and PPE. Would like to talk about like the Firewise program and how that can offset house hardening efforts, but that is a reimbursable grant and how that isn't accessible for all communities. And so that becomes another resource constraint. And then talking about the need for more streamlined processes for rebuilding when we talk about recovery and planners maybe being loaned out to communities after disasters, and that allowing for easier building and rebuilding after a fire. And then with communications, we talked about how often communication services go down as fire approaches, when you lose power, not being able to charge your cell phone. A lot of folks don't have landlines these days. And a couple solutions that got put out there were something like using sirens, like tsunami or tornado sirens in communities in the Midwest or on the coast. And then early and often communication between response agencies. One woman who had been evacuated talked about how they were evacuated earlier than people had been expecting and how that helped with a positive outcome for their community. I think that sums it up. Libby, would you like to go next?
Sure. So our group, we talked about evacuation routes and the need to look for solutions for communities like on the coast where you are only going north and south, and that how you can be, it can cause issues for getting out of town. But if you look at solutions, they're all big ticket items, and really for those solutions to bear out, there's a lot of partnership between agencies and funding resources that are going to be needed to be able to implement those incredibly vital, important evacuation routes. On the coast too, the Confederate tribes, the maintenance of forest roads. So across all ownership, road systems often have multiple agencies with ownership. So again, partnerships needed, funding needed for that. We discussed a little bit about the map coming out and how the map would be used. I think there's, again, what we've heard in other listening sessions is a real need for a public campaign to let people know about their role in keeping communities safe. This has to do with ground fuel, and then that makes fire, and how important it is for people to know that they have a role in keeping that up. I think a call out from DLCD about the great need for feedback from local communities on what the solutions are and what it would take, particularly what it would take to implement any implementations, like resource needs, constraints to carrying these things out. And finally, an interesting discussion about how wildfire mitigation interacts with the Oregon land use goals. So definitely goal 7, but what other goals are going to be involved in this? Sadie, any other?
That was the one I was going to pick. And just to, you know, for everyone on the phone, we had a question about how is DLCD going to consider in the recommendations that we advance all of the potentially implicated goals. So our urbanization goals, our housing goals, our transportation goals, our natural resource goals that consider habitat, et cetera. And the answer is generally, very generally at this point. And really, I think where we get into the finer details of the interaction of our recommendations around wildfire adapted communities and all of our goals is more likely in the space of rulemaking. That's where we iron out some of those details and really get into the tricky work of making it work on the ground. We're lucky at this point to be getting just kind of the big ideas. So thanks, Libby.
Thank you, Sadie.
Libby, if I might, I'm sorry, I forgot. Susan, did you have anything that you'd like to add to our group's discussion?
Unmute myself. You know, I think you covered it all. You know, I think there was a good conversation around kind of recovery and potential barriers that could be eased in communities that really are trying to build back, and also, you know, not build back the same, but build back communities more broadly. And the word wasn't used, but, you know, it made me think about like, how can our communities be more resilient as well as adapted for future wildfire and other, you know, hazards or other impacts. So.
Thanks, Susan. And Chris, would you like to report back?
Yeah, so in our group from the Willamette Valley, we also talked about balancing. One of the issues is the need to balance goals and objectives. You know, setting aside land for housing and economic development, but also making that land resilient to wildfire. So that is definitely a challenge that was identified. Another issue similar to what we've heard before is on transportation. In the case of in the Willamette Valley, there's often just east-west routes. We're talking about specifically the community of Oak Ridge on Highway 58. Where there's, you know, only one way in and one way out, and that was a real challenge. And as a side note, which I thought was interesting, is that Oak Ridge actually saw people coming into that area trying to escape smoke in the valley. So that was just kind of another challenge that they were dealing with, was people not knowing what was going on up there and coming there trying to get out of the smoke that was in the valley. Another big one that came up was the challenge of trying to come up with solutions that work in all different contexts. Obviously, you know, Oregon is a diverse state in terms of landscapes and communities. And so, you know, trying to come up with a one size fits all approach isn't going to work. And then lastly, challenge was the issue around coordination. We talked a lot about other areas that are affected by wildfire, utilities, water supply, and how all that gets considered when coming up with recommendations. On the solution side, the effective communications to different communities was brought up, that they're again, an example of Oak Ridge, where they felt like they had a really good communications from the fire crews that were working there, with community meetings and postings, so that the community felt informed. And so that was a idea for, you know, throughout the state of, you know, emphasizing that. Another one was the idea of incentives rather than regulations. There were some examples given in Oak Ridge and Lane County about grants that were available to landowners to make improvements to reduce fuels and improve their homes in ways that made them more defensible, and then also prioritizing the areas that were in extreme risk. And that type of work also, one side benefit is that it gets staff out into the communities where they can do assessments and educate homeowners, property owners, and that sort of thing. So Matt, I don't know if I missed anything or if you wanted to chime in, but I think that captures what we discussed.
I think that does. I'll just share an observation though. What I noticed is that quite a few people in our group didn't really have anything to say right now. And I think that's okay. Several people explicitly said they're here really listening and trying to gather information. And so what I'm taking away from this is that there are a lot of people who are very interested in this, very, very concerned about it, don't yet have answers or positions, but want to be involved and want to be engaged and want to learn more about it. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so too, Matt. Martin, would you like to share what your group talked about?
This was something that came from kind of the jurisdictional perspective that really kind of catalyzed some conversation. This idea of, if there is a requirement, make sure that it is clearly communicated to the jurisdictions, but perhaps a model code, something so they have a clear understanding of exactly what is being expected of them. And then the follow on to that is make sure that the timeline by which it has to be accomplished is realistic. So clear and realistic were the kind of the key watchwords we heard on that. The idea of, we understand that we may have something to do, but let us know exactly what it is and give us kind of a realistic timeline on which to achieve it. Like many others, we heard a lot about communication and evacuations. Specifically, our conversation about communication touched briefly on recognizing that broadband isn't accessible everywhere. So thinking about other ways to communicate, and then specifically to evacuations, that notion of evacuation route signage is one that came up similar to what you see at the coast. So a recommendation there to start thinking, really kind of keep those ideas of evacuation top of mind. Another item that we had heard that I think another group mentioned as well is this idea of some degree of local flexibility and regional sensitivity. That idea, I think Chris was mentioning it a minute ago, one size does not fit all from one side of the state to the other. So really make sure that there is an appropriate degree of leeway and customization available at the kind of local, maybe even more micro level. So with that, I'll ask Catherine, did I miss anything? Commissioner Warren, anything that I missed from y'all's perspective?
No, I think you did a good job. There were reiterations of some of the other points made in the group. So I think you touched on those things unique to our group. Thank you.
And I think the one thing I'll add that I thought was interesting is kind of the connection between the other mandates that are coming down from the state right now, including House Bill 2001 and the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities rulemaking, see how all these new potential rules could interface with each other. And then also to be aware of the fact that all these jurisdictions have a lot going on because of those two mandates, and just be sensitive to the fact that they don't have unlimited resources.
Thank you, everyone, for the report outs, and thank you for spending time in those breakout rooms and giving us your ideas and the issues that you're seeing, your potential solutions. This is incredibly helpful. I will turn it over to Sadie to talk about our next steps.
Thank you, Kim. We aced that handoff. So proud of us. So the next slide has kind of a very generalized calendar of our community outreach and our report backs to a couple different groups. So you can see here we are in April, May with our community listening sessions. This is the last of 4. I'm kind of sad because they have been incredibly informative, and I've learned a lot, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. But our next step in this process is to start convening meetings of our stakeholder group. So this is a broad group. It's a very diverse group. We think it will represent Oregon and the issues related to wildfire and our different stakeholder interests very well. And that group will take the information that we have gathered here in these community listening sessions, maybe some new ideas, and they will work to refine this broad, set of information and feedback that we have received into our recommendations. We will take our draft recommendations to the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So that is Commissioner Warren and his colleagues that serve on our commission at their July meeting. So this yellow star is their meeting towards the end of July. and again in September. So for those not familiar with the commission, that's 2 consecutive meetings. We meet 6 times a year. We'll also be presenting kind of where we are in the process to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, which is represented here by the green star, both in July and then again when we present our final recommendations and report, which are due on October 1st. There'll be 1 meeting of our stakeholder group in between the time that we get feedback on our draft recommendations from commission and when we bring them a final report. And importantly, I think for this group and for everyone that is interested, both of our land conservation and LCDC, just gonna call it the acronym, both our LCDC presentations will be public comment items. So at that point, you know, the commission and staff really benefit from hearing feedback from a lot of different people that maybe weren't able to be involved in the process throughout. It really helps inform our work and carry it forward. So those are both public comment items. And then we will be bringing the final report to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and Oregon Legislature by that October 1st deadline. And to note for this group, the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council has their own charge to develop recommendations related to the wildland urban interface and I think the statewide map. And so they have a working group that is sort of running concurrent to the development of recommendations that DLCD is doing. So we are informed about that work, but we are not kind of included in it because it's their charge to do. And I think our process is maybe a bit more accessible to the general public. I don't think that the advisory council for the wildfire program has the same opportunity to include the broad feedback that DLCD is able to. Throughout the process, we have a tribal consultation that's ongoing. Right now, we have engaged 2 of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes, but the invitation remains open for any others that would like to have either a presentation, staff-to-staff consultation, or government-to-government consultation. And then finally, I just want to mention, and Susan, maybe you could drop this in the chat for me. We are also in the process at DLCD of developing our budget. So the agency requests a budget in advance of the 2023 legislative session, which is when our budget will be determined by the Ways and Means Committee, which is part of the legislature. But so we are developing our budget requests right now, and part of that process is soliciting feedback through community listening sessions, much like the one we are all at today, on our different budget development requests. And also a legislative concept that we have that's kind of on a similar timeline and trajectory and is part of the same process. And the reason I call that to your attention is we do have a budget request related to wildfire. So it's POP 202 if you're opening that link to a document that Susan just shared out. POP is state agency code for policy option package, which is also state agency code for a budget request. So that means DLCD is asking for money. We're asking for staff. We know that we can't accomplish what we want to for Oregonians to make safer communities with the resources that we have. And so there's kind of a brief description in that 2-pager. But again, we're in the process of soliciting feedback. So if you want to attend one of those, we would love to have you. And then not linked in that document, but I'll just tell you about it here verbally. We're developing what's called a legislative concept, and that supports what we are asking for in our budget request. And it's written very generally at this point because we don't have any specific recommendations. And so we're putting in a placeholder concept and letting legislative drafting know that we will provide details when we're done with this process based on the results we have here. And that hopefully will advance again in the 2023 session. And maybe we'll be doing this again in 2024. And happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Sadie. Looks like Karine has a question.
So just
kind of make sure I understand the timing of things here. It sounds like that legislative request placeholder may incorporate some of the things that are being recommended in the report to the legislature. And the legislature gets the report and then they're like, oh yeah, we want this, that, and the other thing to advance. And then those things move forward as part of the legislative concept. And then after that happens, assuming bills get adopted, then there might be then some of that rulemaking that you've mentioned previously. Am I tying the whole kind of?
You are hitting it on the head, Karine. That's exactly right.
Excellent.
So yeah, we have our recommendations being developed. They will inform the legislative concept, which is a placeholder right now. Both our budget request and potential legislation gets carried forward in the 2023 session. At the end of that session, we get a legislatively adopted budget. And that says DLCD, here's the money you get, here's what it's for. And then we can advance and do whatever the legislature directs us to do. Leah, you have your hand up. Hi.
Hi, Sadie. Yeah. I do have a question, and this might not be a question for you, might be someone else, but a lot of what I heard in the breakouts was kind of a mix of like land use recommendations, right, which are clearly in DLCD's wheelhouse. But then I also heard a lot around like fuels management and kind of the forestry side that would be more ODF's charge and the concurrent work that they're doing. And then the third kind of category of things I heard were more emergency operations. And I know there's emergency managers that I noticed on the call today. I'm wondering, in DLCD's process, are you including all three of those buckets in terms of your considerations and future recommendations? Are you going to narrow it to land use? And then secondarily, kind of what happens with those elements that are more emergency management functions, I guess. And just one example I heard was around communications infrastructure. And that's really maybe outside of the wheelhouse of DLCD and more of a OEM issue.
Well, you know, that's such a good question, Leah. So thank you for asking it. One thing I can say is that in the legislative concept that I was just referring to, we have asked the legislature to direct state agency coordination among many of the agencies invoked in Senate Bill 762 and some that are not. But OEM is part of that, because what we have heard again and again in these community listening sessions is a real need for effective communication from the top down, effective coordinated communication that people can rely upon. And it takes it takes a bunch of forms, from evacuation being effective and evacuation orders being provided in language appropriate ways, to what resources are available and from whom. And if I want to put defensible space on my property, is there money for it? To local governments needing information to provide to folks about zoning changes at a local level, building hardening standards that will become effective when the map is released, etc. So we at DLCD see a real benefit to and a need for state agency coordination. And I think that capturing the ideas that we are here really helps support that element of the legislative concept, and also, just supports our work, our more coordinated work in the future with those agencies. So I don't know if that's a total answer, but I think it's a really important question. So thank you for asking.
Great, thanks, Sadie. And then I would just add, before I see your hand up, Peggy, that also part of, the Senate Bill 762 work is, under the purview of the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. So those 11 state agencies, are reporting back and getting feedback from the council as well. And so I think, providing these recommendations outside of DLCD's wheelhouse to the council will be another way to communicate what we've heard, and then they can determine, how to, what to do with that information, and their work with the other state agencies. So
Yeah, perfect follow-up. Thanks, Susan.
we have one more question, Kurt.
Thank you. This might be for Sadie. The state has a position called the State Resiliency Officer, and that position was created to coordinate all state agencies on matters of resiliency. I have not noticed that position being involved in wildfire recovery. That may be happening, I don't see it. But is there a position, similar position in the state related to wildfire recovery that's really focused with coordinating all state agencies on this matter?
Again, a great question. And I would say the closest thing that I know of, and Matt or others on the call may be able to chime in about the role of the State Resiliency Officer. But Director Doug Graff, formerly of the Oregon Department of Forestry, has been named the Wildfire Programs Director out of the Governor's Office, and that was a position established through Senate Bill 762 to coordinate the work of state agencies in implementation. And as that relates to recovery, Senate Bill 762, as written, does not take a holistic look at recovery, but it is very much on Director Graff's mind, and he is asking state agencies who are implementing this work to think very carefully about the roles that we could play in recovery, specifically as it comes to connecting communities, local jurisdictions, and areas that have had wildfire emergencies to recovery resources. And so that's something we're looking at in our legislative concept as well.
So I think we've moved on to the slide. I just wanted to add to responding to Kurt that Matt Garrett has been serving in that role as the wildfire recovery coordination person. I do believe he's transitioning out of that role, and I don't know exactly what's happening there, but that has been looked at.
I understood that to be somewhat of a temporary role in response to the 2020 wildfires.
Yeah, exactly.
That's been very helpful. Michael Mortar has also been involved through that office and has been involved in some communities. It's been very effective in my view, and it would be nice to see some permanence to that. But there's a lot of things we'd all like to see.
All right. Looks like Peggy has a question.
So I really wanted to follow up with the rest of this discussion. So both the fire marshal's office got another 38 people to help with this work from the defensible space side, but OEM also got a number of new positions to be able to have some of the conversations that were just brought up, Kurt, related to making sure that statewide, locally, that there is that discussion around the OEM side of things. So this last legislative session, we were very lucky to get the additional staffing, including Susan, to be able to make sure that we're doing the coordination amongst agencies for these various efforts. Thank you.
Great questions, everyone. So it is 4 minutes before 3, so I'm gonna wrap up. And thanks to Sadie and everyone for the follow-up questions, really helpful. So as you can see on the last slide, we do have a community survey coming soon. So everyone who has participated or signed up for our listening sessions will receive a follow-up email with a link to that survey, as well as an online open house that will have a lot of the project background information, and we encourage you to share that with folks who weren't able to attend any of the listening sessions as we continue to get feedback through this process. Also on the DLCD webpage, which was the link was dropped in the chat, you can sign up there for our Gov Delivery project notices. We'll have links to the videos of all of the listening sessions and a summary of the sessions, as well as meeting information for the upcoming stakeholder group meetings, as well as upcoming Land Conservation and Development Commission meetings. And so that's a great place to look for information. And as we do have, updates, we'll share that through Gov Delivery as well. And last slide, please. Yeah. And so again, thank you to everyone for taking time to participate in today's session. We really do appreciate the input and the conversations that we've had, and have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.